My first claim, atheists reject God, but they don't understand what they're rejecting.
So I would like to tackle this in good faith. So I identify as an atheist, gun to my head. I don't think God exists, but I think I'm technically agnostic atheist in the sense that I don't know, because I don't think you can know these things. It's the responsibility of the believers to kind of prove that God exists. But I also think that believe and know are different things, which even Jordan Peterson gets into.
So do you believe in the all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good notion of God?
What do you mean by believe?
Do you think it to be true?
He thinks believe is something you live and die for.
If
What's
you
a belief?
believe something, you stake your life on it.
What do you mean by that?
You live for it and you die for it.
I think believe is something you have faith in, and know is something that is objective. Objective is kind of contradictory in a sense because we are reliant on our perception. So objective in terms of the collective agreeing is one version. Objective in terms of outside of our perception and is another way to look at it. So when he says this, atheists are rejecting God, but they don't understand what they're rejecting. I think in good faith, this relates to sort of his conversation that he's had in the past with other atheists like Richard Dawkins.
Dragon fight story is explore the dangerous unknown, discover the treasure that revitalizes the community. There's no difference between that and the science that you practice. They're the same thing.
What do you think of
It's
that,
the
Richard?
same story.
I don't know what to make of that. I mean, you say they're the same story. You've analogized the dragon fight to
Well, how many
fighting
dragons have you
Satan.
overcome in your life?
I'm not interested in dragons. I'm interested in reality.
I think Richard rejects any explorative action in relation to the metaphysical because he feels like it's contrary to his scientific bubble.
I read a book a while back that described the biological reality of the dragon. Say, well, there's no such thing as a dragon. It's like, okay, is there such a thing as a predator?
Of course.
Well, that's a meta category. What's the category of predator? Bear, eagle, if you're a primate. Fire? Is fire a predator?
No.
Well, it's complicated because a fire kills you. So is there a worse predator than serpentine, flying, fire-breathing reptile? Is that not the imagistic equivalent of predator?
So when Peterson says to Dawkins, let's talk about dragons, let's talk about whether or not fire is a predator, I think that's what Peterson means by God, and it's why Richard Dawkins rejects it.
So in what way, if predator is real, in what way isn't dragon real? It doesn't take that much imagination to see the identity.
I don't know why you say dragon. I mean, we have lions, we have tigers, we have saber-tooths, we have
Why not
tyrannosaurs
abstract?
out there.
Right, but why not abstract?
Because for him, it doesn't make any sense. But for me, somebody who loves philosophy and somebody who loves the metaphysical and somebody who does think there is a way to metaphorically debate God or discuss God by discussing whether or not, you're fighting a dragon or are a dragon, or whether or not fire is a predator, or whether or not predator is something like a dragon. I think that's what is happening here. But I can't know, and I don't even know if Peterson knows. And that's where I think I struggle. I think it's where a lot of us struggle. Does Peterson mean that, or am I being too good faith in what he means? Because then Peterson goes on this journey of actually trying to figure out if God is real. But then he talks about God in the metaphorical. So I think he's confused and then we're confused. But I think in the most good faith, if I had to think about all his past discussions, Richard Dawkins, all his collabs with atheists, I think he wishes to discuss God metaphysically, metaphorically, in the, the imagination of it all. But it's like his imagination, but it's literal.
Oh, brother!
And I think there's something to say about spiritual bubbles and how spiritual bubbles kind of do engage in sort of using imagination to explain the unimaginable. But I think that's a struggle for a lot of people because it doesn't feel grounded. So look at the way this one person comes to respond to Peterson, and let's use them as somebody who's talking very literally about things, and Peterson, who's talking more metaphysically.
My background is in studying to become a traditional Catholic priest, daily mass, daily rosary, going on long retreats, deep into the magisterium and biblical hermeneutics. Like, I was thoroughly in it. And it seems like I do know what I'm missing. Is there something that I missed over years of study, both this issue formally and living out religion so deeply?
So I want to answer this question for Peterson, because I think this is what Peterson means to say, but maybe this is also me being good faith, because I don't like Jordan Peterson. You don't like Jordan Peterson. He's lost. I made a whole podcast about how he's like Azula and Judas, links in the description. Please check it out. If I'm being good faith, if I was Peterson asking or saying this statement, I think what I would say to him is, you were looking for a literal, tangible God, and you found that he wasn't there. As a former Catholic myself, I get it. But what Peterson is trying to say is that you're not looking for a real God, but you're looking for the realness of what God makes us feel being alive. But I don't know if Peterson knows that himself. So this is hard for me because I'm trying to think about what Peterson's thinking and what he's thinking, what everyone's thinking. But I do think, as a person who also grew up in a very religious home, my mom goes to daily mass. My parents are doing like this 10-year novena. Like my parents are very Catholic. They do daily rosaries themselves. Like I get it. I think there's a difference between literally, tangibly knowing God, saying that this is a literal fact, and somebody who's having a very profound relationship with what they call God or the universe, which is why, again, there's an overlap between spiritual bubbles, religious bubbles, and sort of atheist bubbles. And I kind of wonder, like, should Peterson have been like a witch?
Her sister was a witch!
Is he more of a energy through the universe kind of spiritual person? Or is he actually trying to use spiritualism to find concrete evidence of God? And I think that's what really throws everybody off about Peterson.
Well, you obviously feel that you missed something when you were practicing for the priesthood. Your aim was off then. So
And
there's
so-
always the possibility that it's still off now.
What was off about my aim in the first
I
place?
don't know. That might take a long time to figure out.
Which is true. So again, when I hear Peterson say this in the most good faith, what I am hearing is that he does know there's something more to life than just atheism. Because I identify as an atheist because it's quite a good label, but it doesn't quite encompass the reality of the unknown. So I think anything that is true can be proven true, and there's a trail of data to prove it. So if God is real, there'll be a trail of data to prove it, in the same way that I can prove that we're on a planet in the universe, right? Like in the same way that I can tangibly kind of prove that I exist, I think God is just as tangible if they exist. But I think what happens is that Peterson and maybe other people are talking about God in this great universal sense, this thing bigger than yourself. But then we're not talking about God like traditional Christians do, which is why most of the people having this conversation with Peterson were like, you're not talking about God the way Christians talk about God. But then he'll say, what about this Christian? What about this Christian? Yeah, it's like Richard Dawkins saying he's socially or culturally Christian now. I think ultimately what's happening is the lack of deconstruction from white men. I said it. It's the white men problem.
Well, I must say I was slightly horrified to hear that Ramadan is being promoted instead. I do think that we are culturally a Christian country. I call myself a cultural Christian. I'm not a believer.
White men are trying so hard to figure out what is the universal answer, but they're stuck in white men thinking.
The fundamental weakness of Western civilization is empathy.
A white man? No!
So Richard Dawkins spends his whole career deconstructing Christianity and being a protesting, militant atheist, wanting to take down Christians. And now he's so afraid of Muslims that he's become a cultural Christian. Jordan Peterson, so afraid of gender, transgender, all of the genders. He's so terrified that now he's clinging to Christianity, but only to the white Christianity. And then he rejects all spiritual bubbles, the gender construct. It's so interesting that Peterson will debate with Dawkins and say, can't you talk to me about how fire is a predator? But he won't talk to somebody else about how there is a multitude of genders. We're so limited by our own fear and our own capacity for deconstruction and thinking outside the box. But the dilemma is that you don't want to think so outside the box, you kind of lose yourself, right, to madness. So you want to ground yourself in a reality. But when you ground yourself, it has to be on something tangible. This is why I think Peterson is kind of going insane, which is why I compared him to a Judas or an Azula. He's losing himself to the journey of the deconstruction, to the journey of the curiosity. What is my life? What does it mean? What does it mean to be a person? He's losing himself to it. He's not grounding himself in some sort of thing to come back to. And I think that's why he's lost. Peterson, I think fairly, is afraid what it could mean that God exists. And I think that is interesting. I personally think you should let go of any attachment and accept whatever is true. So if God is real, great. If he's not real, great. Instead of thinking about being afraid, be excited, because it means we have some more answers in the universe. I don't think you should do anything when you're desperate or afraid. And Peterson is very afraid. And he does a lot on the internet through his work and his relationships while being very afraid. And I think that's kind of what shows up in this conversation.
Then it seems kind of like this no true Scotsman type of fallacy in which you're the arbiter of people's aims and how they understand those aims to be. How is it that you can claim that people don't know something that you know about their life despite not having met them?
Well, very easily, in the same way that I can look at a homophobe and say, oh, that's homophobia. And they're like, that's not homophobia. You don't know me. But I can tell it's homophobia. In the same way, I can look at anyone else and say, ooh, by the way you're talking, I can kind of tell where you're at in life. But also, I can't read your mind, so I could be wrong. But I can make a best guess. And I think Peterson is somewhat good at that, but really horrible at it. 99% of the time, Curran Peterson has lost himself in his ability to judge people and where they're at. But I think a lot of us do that constantly. It's how we socialize. It's how we read the room. Or maybe that's just my autism, but I know for a fact that most of us are socializing by sort of understanding where people are coming from, seeing the clothes they wear, seeing the language they use, you know, if you're hanging out with people who have deconstructed versus people who haven't, like you can kind of tell like, oh, where they're at, right? So I feel like instead of saying I'm reading your mind, you can just say I'm using the data that you're presenting to me to come to a conclusion that may or may not be correct. That's really what's happening, right?
Well, it's obviously a generic claim, just like the atheist claim that there's no God is a generic.
Well, the generic claim that there's no God, as if to say that I have researched and seen every corner of the universe, I think is incorrect, which is why atheism as a label is nice. It quickly gets to the point of what you're trying to convey, but it's not as honest or objective. Like the label atheism isn't objective, in the same way that the label Christian is not objective. They're both subjective labels used to convey and signal to a group of people who understand what the label means. They don't have access to the objective. They have no way to know if God exists. They have only a way to know that he doesn't exist in the constructs that have been presented to us. We know that God does not exist in the constructs that have been presented to us because none of the evidence brings us to a conclusion that's reliable and can be tested time and time again to give us the same result. That in that sense, it makes sense for atheists to reject the constructs of God that have been presented to us. But is Peterson, hear me out, offering a different construct of God, but yet relying on those Abrahamic constructs to convey this universe God that he's trying to sort of have a conversation about? I don't know, but I think he's trying, but he's failing miserably, maybe.
In your case, it would have to be specified more, and I'm not claiming to understand what was going on in your mind, but my experience with atheists is twofold, is that they have a very reductive notion of what constitutes God, let's say in the Judeo-Christian tradition, and they've often been hurt by someone who was religious or by the religious enterprise or perhaps by God himself, so to speak, and that's left them with an animus.
See, this is very much like your trauma is making you hate God. That's possible. And most of us deconstruct religious trauma. I definitely went through a militant atheist, era of my life. And then when I deconstructed, I realized I didn't care if people were religious. I cared that they used their subjective reality to take away people's basic civil rights or human rights, right? So I do agree that coming out of religion, you can be traumatized. But once you deconstruct that and you're kind of chill with people being religious, it doesn't mean that you still sit by while religious people use their doctrines to be homophobic or transphobic or racist, right? So I agree that that could be a possibility, but I don't think it's a possibility after deconstruction. So that's why I never really liked Richard Dawkins, if I'm going to be honest with you, because even at 19, when I left the church, I just thought he was like way too angry about it. And for him to have the audacity all these years later to be like, I'm a cultural Christian, girl, that's just racism. That's just Islamophobia. Like, you are Islamophobic. That's why I don't like Sam Harris. It's why I just don't like these white men atheists who are sitting here and talking so badly about other people's religions because they're foreign to them, and then they're somehow embracing Christianity again. It's like, what happened to this like atheist energy you brought into the world when I was a kid? Anyways, okay. So I can agree to that idea, but not for all people. Like, I personally have deconstructed my religious trauma, and now I, once again, am okay with people being religious, but you can't use it to be bigoted. In a queer sense, I think all patriarchal religion should be deconstructed. So I don't understand why gay people or women or black people or brown people are part of these patriarchal, white-led, white supremacist religions, but I'm not going to stop you legally from doing it. I'm not going to take away your right to be religious. I do think religious institutions should pay tax, though, because God knows they're making money, and God knows every church I've ever been in has absolutely told people how to vote and how to participate in politics. And I know some of the language I'm using could be triggering to some Peterson fans. No offense. You want to talk about God and the universe, and then you're afraid of my language? What are we even talking about if we're talking about the seriousness of God existing in the universe? And you can't handle some of my language choices. You know what I mean? What are we really talking about?
I think that you have a reductive view of what atheism is. You've defined religion so broadly to include any sort of having aim in life, any sort of cultural archetypes, or having a metaphorical substrate. And atheism to you is a very specific type of like three people in the world that are these Raskolnikov type of, they want to get away with a perfect murder. It seems like you have the reductive view of what an atheist is.
Well, let's start.
I think that's true. Him saying atheists are traumatized is reductive. We're all traumatized, Jordan. Jordan should know he's a walking trauma bomb. That's what I'm saying. Jordan is traumatized. Everyone is traumatized. We all exist in the world. The world is traumatizing. It's on a spectrum. We all have to deconstruct our own trauma. But to say that atheists are traumatized, so Yes, maybe. But that's why we have to deconstruct, hey, why do I feel this way? Why do I think this way? Why do I have these thoughts? Where did these thoughts come from? Jordan being super transphobic is a great example. He thinks all of these girls are so traumatized they're becoming trans. But I would say Jordan is somehow so traumatized that he's become transphobic. Something is going on there. Why are you coming to these conclusions about whole groups of people and off what basis? Now, example is when I say all men are misogynistic under patriarchy, that's not to say you're born that way. It's to say you're formed that way because of culture. Culture has convinced men they are inherently XYZ and women are inherently XYZ, but we don't have data to know that people are inherently born a gender and therefore act XYZ. When you say these things like, I'm a man, I have to be this way, where is that construct coming from? Who taught you that men act this way? Because somebody gave you that as a lesson to use as sort of a script to then act on. Okay, so I think there's something to be said here about Peterson being reductive because he is being reductive.
How do you define the God that you're rejecting? Like, what is God to you? You studied in the church, you found that unsatisfactory. How would you characterize what you rejected?
I think the average Christian believer, when they say that they're Christian and they believe, they mean some sort of God that is all-powerful, all-perfect, is somehow involved in the matters of this world, and that we look to them through wisdom and with the Logos incarnate in Christ. And it also seems like you don't believe in religion in the way that the average Christian says that they believe in religion. And there are as many gods out there as there are believers, because everybody has mutually exclusive and different views of what God is. So it seems
Well,
like...
if everybody had mutually exclusive views of what God is, no one could speak to each other. The mere fact of communication presumes a commonality of assumption and definition.
Right. The commonality and definition is bigger than us, greater than us, supernatural, metaphysical. Like those are the usual commonalities we have from spiritual bubbles to like nature bubbles to religious, traditional religious bubbles. That would be the commonality. But the tangibility of it is the difference. Like some people believe there are statue gods and they pray in temples and there's a literal God who's like coming into our tangible life. There are people who believe in possession and demons. There are people who believe that spirits roam the earth. Like these are the differences. These are the big differences that are clashing, right? But I think generally the only shared commonality is the idea of something bigger than ourselves, something magical and profound, something outside of being a human, right? That would probably be what I would say is the quote overlap.
Let me give you an example. For
Precisely.
example, there's a sub-narrative in the story of Moses where Moses is rewarded with a glimpse of God. Okay, and that's one of the ways that God is characterized in the Old Testament stories.
Yes.
Now, Moses is a faithful servant of God and a good man. At least that's the case within the confines of the story.
One possible
It's
interpretation.
the case within the confines of the story, obviously.
Well, not obviously. When we look at the Bible can't precisely say anything because there are so many different exegetical and hermeneutic views of this particular book, and that everybody has everybody has disagreed historically on, it seems like, even the most benign detail about a book this big.
He's not listening to Peterson. I will say this. Peterson's right. If you learn the story of Moses, Moses is a complicated man who is the hero of the story. He saves his people, frees his people from slavery. Okay, he's the hero. Next.
And it seems like you can only say that the Bible says something if you first presuppose that it's univocal.
So your claim essentially is that Moses in the Old Testament plays the role of a villain or is irrelevant? Because the alternative claim
I'm
is
saying that we
he's
can't
good.
know.
That's ridiculous. That's like watching Avatar: The Last Airbender and you can't figure out if Aang is the good guy or the bad guy. Well, you know he's the good guy because the story tells us. It's obvious. This argument's silly.
God rewards Moses with a glimpse of the divine. So this is a definition of the God that atheists are hypothetically rejecting.
A possible one.
I said ah.
Yeah.
I didn't say the. I
know.
said ah.
That is possible, yes.
Okay. So despite the fact that Moses is a stellar character and he's had a long and difficult life and can withstand a lot of difficulty.
I mean, Moses had to deconstruct his own relationship. This is a great example. Moses had to deconstruct his own connection to his people, right? Over being an Egyptian prince, right? So he had to deconstruct his status as a privileged person in a society in which he was adopted into in order to really face himself and realize he needs to free his people because what's happening to his people is wrong, but not because it was wrong outside of him connecting to the people. Had Moses never realized he was also a part of his people being enslaved, would he even have cared? It's because of his connection to the different bubbles that allowed him to bubble hop and allowed him to have the realization in the bubble pop of like, oh, it wasn't that he was Egyptian, had the realization what they were doing was unethical and freed the slaves. It was that he is one of those slaves who is accidentally freed, sort of, by being sort of, adopted. So the irony is that he kind of has to deconstruct all of that, because he certainly lived his life full of prejudice for people who were like him because he thought he wasn't them. So that's a whole thing to deconstruct, right? But that's really what's happening with Ramses, his brother, and this idea that Ramses and Moses were like, this whole thing is a deconstruction story, but it led him to the God of the Jews or the God of the Old Testament, right? So there's something to be said about whether that part is true. But what is true is that universal story of realizing that you could be the bad guy and the good guy in the story. We are all the villains and the heroes of anyone's story, our story, their story, his story. So it's an opportunity for us to realize like, damn, the bad guy, am I the baddie? Right? Like that's the meme. Are we the baddies? But that's why you have to work to be less bad every day instead of more good, because the road to hell is paved in good intentions. And I think Jordan Peterson has a lot of good intentions, which is why it's been hell observing him.
God puts him between two cliffs, so he can just see a crack of what's in front of him. And when God walks by, he allows him to see his back. Okay, so the implication of that story is that the divine is fundamentally unknowable. It's a pinnacle experience, and that people in their finitude have to be shielded from a comprehensive vision of the basis of reality. The God that's defined in that manner, right, is not a simple personification. It's not a simple old man in the sky. It's something that in its essence is unknowable and overwhelming.
Okay. I grew up Catholic, and I learned that if you even knew a pinky of what God knew, your brain would explode because it's overwhelming. I think this could be a sort of metaphor for introspection, extrospection. So I have my own philosophical system. It's in progress. I'm working on it. It's called the levels. And what I'm trying to describe is a phenomenon that I went through, which was like oh my gosh, like this idea that like we really are just like living biological creatures on a planet, living through a subjective lens of do we even know? And it's past God, past the universe, past our beliefs. It's this idea that we cling to belief. We needed belief to make civilization. We never needed facts. We needed very little facts to build all of civilization. That is a horrifying realization. Okay. It might be the same feeling of seeing or knowing an ounce of God, a finger of God, a pinky of God. Seeing just the back of God is like mind-blowing, right? So you know how you have these ego deaths, these realizations, you have these like, oh my gosh, like the world doesn't revolve around my own thought, my own consciousness, my own ego. Like I am here observing and participating. I'm an observer of life, right? That could be the metaphor that Peterson is trying to convey, that is God, this realization of how profound and meaningful it is that we exist in the first place. Except Peterson takes it to a weird transphobic place, which contradicts his connection to the realization that like it's so much bigger than us without it being a mystical God that is tangible and causing miracles, right? That the universe itself is so profoundly, just mind-blowingly unknowable that, in some ways to keep ourselves sane, our egos have to convince us that we know what it means to be alive, what it means to have purpose. So funny enough, John Vervaeke, who's collabed with Peterson in the past, I'm a big fan of Vervaeke's work. The Meaning Crisis, really great, right? Him and Peterson have gone in different directions in terms of tackling this sort of unknowable. Like Vervaeke's much more progressive and Peterson's much more conservative, and it's very interesting. But I think what's great about Vervaeke is that he stays relatively grounded and Peterson doesn't. And I think it's because Vervaeke is curious about what is true and Peterson is afraid of what could be true. Peterson is nothing but fear. So Moses having a glimpse of God's back, shattering, like life shattering, like, whoa, like I can't even process the glory of God. This is the same feeling I think you have when you realize you really are in a rock floating through space, and not in this like basic nihilistic reductive sense. I mean, quite literally, we exist on this planet as if we do not exist on a planet. Human beings work every day. We get lost every day. Look at me right now making content about Peterson when I'm literally like a flying organism in a universe. Like, who cares? But we care because all of civilization is built off of us living in this very micro bubble when there's a whole macro world. So when we have any introduction, any connection to the macro, we feel it's so profound, it must be God. And my argument is that it's not God, it's just reality. And reality itself is so overwhelming that when we get a glimpse of it, it almost breaks our brain. That's why we create lore and fiction and religion to kind of keep us grounded. But you don't need it to be grounded. You just need to accept that you are a part of the universe instead of thinking you're outside of it. This is why when I talk to people, they will say we're above nature. We've learned to be outside of nature. You are nature. Oh, God put us here. We're a gift from God. They're constantly creating story to make themselves better than the animal, even though we are literally animals, better than the universe, even though we are a part of the universe, greater than even what we can, conceive, which is why God exists. But it is quite great that we exist. So I think that's what Peterson's getting at, and yet he doesn't even know it. Like I look at him and I hear him and I think, are you understanding what you're even saying? I don't think he understands even what he's saying. But in the most good faith way, this is my deconstruction of what Peterson could be meaning or could be discovering, but he keeps trying to attach this realization to a biblical God, which is the mistake. I think that's why he refuses to actually call himself a Christian, is because he knows it's not true. He knows there is no such thing as a Christian God, but there might be something as true as a metaphorical, metaphysical God. It's just not a Christian one. It's not a Muslim one. It's not an Abrahamic one. It's not a real tangible thing. It is the fact that we exist in this ever-evolving, very unknowable universe. And that would be overwhelming for just about anybody to have that realization. Now, will Peterson actually have it, or will he one day come out as a Catholic? Probably, because he's so homophobic and transphobic. But, this is what happens when people don't deconstruct. They discover without the deconstruction. They have a realization without knowing why. Peterson is lacking his why. And I am curious to see where he'll be in 10 to 15 years. Anyways, that's the section I wanted to talk about. I want to stop here because honestly, I think I've said enough. And I would love to know what you guys think in the comment section. Talk to you guys soon. Please like, subscribe, and I'll see you for the next one. Bye.